Randy grew up in a college town in eastern Washington state, graduated from the University of Washington in Seattle, and landed a clerk typist 2 job at the library there, specifically the interlibrary loan department, where his job was to process incoming loan requests mailed in from smaller libraries all over the region, and conversely, to mail out requests to other libraries. If 9-year-old Randy Waterhouse had been able to look into the future and see himself in this career, he would have been delighted beyond measure. The primary tool of the interlibrary loan department was the staple remover. Young Randy had seen one of these devices in the hands of his 4th grade teacher and been enthralled by its cunning and deadly appearance, so like the jaws of some futuristic robot dragon. He had, in fact, gone out of his way to staple things incorrectly just so he could prevail on his teacher to unstaple them, giving him another glimpse of the blood-chilling mandibles in action. He had gone so far as to steal a staple remover from an untended desk at church, and then incorporate it into an erector set robot hunter-killer device with which he terrorized much of the neighborhood. Its pit viper yawn separated many a cheap plastic toy from its parts and accessories before the theft was discovered and Randy made an example of before God and man. Now, in the interlibrary loan office, Randy had not just one but several staple removers in his desk drawer and was actually obligated to use them for an hour or 2 a day. Since the UW library was well endowed, its patrons didn't request books from other libraries unless they had been stolen from their own or were in some way peculiar. The ill office, as Randy and his coworkers affectionately called it, had its regulars, people who had a whole lot of peculiar books on their wish lists. These people tended to be either tedious or scary or both. Randy always ended up dealing with the both subgroup, because Randy was the only clerk typist in the office who was not a lifer. It seemed clear that Randy, with his astronomy degree and his extensive knowledge of computers, would one day move on, whereas his coworkers did not harbor further ambitions. His larger sphere of interests, his somewhat broader concept of normalcy, was useful when certain patrons came into the office. By the standards of many, Randy was himself a tedious, scary, obsessed character. He was not merely obsessed with science, but also with fantasy role-playing games. The only way he could tolerate working at such a stupid job for a couple of years was that his off time was completely occupied with enacting fantasy scenarios of a depth and complexity that exercised all of the cranial circuitry that was so conspicuously going to waste in the ill office. He was part of a group that would meet every Friday night and play until sometime on Sunday. The other stalwarts in the group were a computer science music double major named Chester and a history grad student named Avi. When a new master's degree candidate named Andrew Loeb walked into the ill office one day with a certain glint in his eye and produced a 3-inch stack of precisely typed request forms from his shitty old knapsack, he was recognized immediately as being of a particular type and shunted in the direction of Randy Waterhouse. It was an instant meeting of minds, though Randy did not fully realize this until the books that Loeb had requested began to arrive on the trolley from the mailroom. Andy Loeb's project was to figure out the energy budgets of the local Indian tribes. A human body has to expend a certain amount of energy just to keep breathing and to maintain its body temperature. This figure goes up when it gets cold or when the body in question is doing work. The only way to obtain that energy is by eating food. Some foods have a higher energy content than others. For example, trout is highly nutritious, but so low in fat and carbohydrates that you can starve to death eating it 3 times a day. Other foods might have lots of energy, but might require so much work to obtain and prepare that eating them would be a losing proposition. Andy Loeb was trying to figure out what foods had historically been eaten by certain Northwest Indian tribes, how much energy they expended to get these foods, and how much they obtained by eating them. He wanted to do this calculation for coastal Indians, like the Salish, who had easy access to seafood, and for inland ones, like the Cayuse, who didn't. As part of an extremely convoluted plan to prove some sort of point about the relative standards of living of these tribes and how this affected their cultural development, coastal tribes made lots of fantastically detailed art, and inland ones occasionally scratched stick figures on rocks. To Andrew Loeb, it was an exercise in metahistorical scholarship. To Randy Waterhouse, it sounded like the beginnings of a pretty cool game. Strangle a muskrat, and you get 136 energy points. Lose the muskrat, and your core temp drops another degree. Andy was nothing if not methodical, and so he had simply looked up every book that had ever been written on such topics, and every book mentioned in those books' bibliographies, yea, even unto 4 or 5 generations, checked out all of them that were available locally, and ordered the rest from ill. All of the latter passed across Randy's desk. Randy read some and skimmed all. He got to learn about how much blubber the Arctic explorers had to eat in order to keep from starving to death. He perused detailed specifications for Army sea rations. After a while, he actually began sneaking into the photocopy room and making copies of key data. In order to run a realistic fantasy role-playing game, you had to keep track of how much food the imaginary characters were getting and how much trouble was involved in getting it. Characters passing across the Gobi Desert in November of the year 5000 BC would have to spend more time worrying about food than, say, ones who were traveling across central Illinois in 1950. Randy was hardly the first game designer to notice this. There were a few incredibly stupid games in which you didn't have to think about food, but Randy and his friends disdained them. In all of the games that he participated in or that he himself designed, you had to devote a realistic amount of effort to getting food for your character. But it was not easy to determine what was realistic. Like most designers, Randy got over the problem by slapping together a few rudimentary equations that he basically just pulled out of thin air. But in the books, articles, and dissertations that Andrew Loeb was borrowing through ill, he found exactly the raw data that a mathematically inclined person would need to come up with a sophisticated rule system based on scientific fact. Simulating all of the physical processes going on in each character's body was out of the question, especially in a game where you might be dealing with armies of 100,000 men. Even a crude simulation tracking only a few variables and using simple equations would involve a nightmarish amount of paperwork if you did it all by hand. But all of this was happening in the mid-1980s, when personal computers had become cheap and ubiquitous. A computer could automatically track a large database and tell you whether each character was well-fed or starving. There was no reason not to do it on a computer. Unless, like Randy Waterhouse, you had such a shitty job that you couldn't afford a computer. Of course, there's a way to dodge any problem. The university had lots of computers. If Randy could get an account on one of them, he could write his program there and run it for free. Unfortunately, accounts were only available to students or faculty members, and Randy was neither. Fortunately, he started dating a grad student named Charlene at just about this time. How the hell did a generally keg-shaped guy, a hard scientist, working a dead-end clerk typist job, and spending all his spare time in the consummately nerdy pastime of fantasy role-playing games, end up in a relationship with a slender and not unattractive young liberal arts student who spent her spare time sea kayaking and going to foreign films? It must have been one of those opposites attract kind of deals, a complementary relationship. They met, naturally, in the ill office, where the highly intelligent but steady and soothing Randy helped the highly intelligent but scattered and flighty Charlene organize a messy heap of loan requests. He should have asked her out then and there, but he was shy. Second and third opportunities came along when the books she'd requested began to filter up from the mailroom, and finally he asked her out, and they went to see a film together. Both of them turned out to be not just willing, but eager and possibly even desperate. Before they knew it, Randy had given Charlene a key to his apartment, and Charlene had given Randy the password to her free university computer account, and everything was just delightful. The university computer system was better than no computer at all, but Randy was humiliated. Like every other high-powered academic computing network, this one was based on an industrial-strength operating system called Unix, which had a learning curve like the Matterhorn, and lacked the cuddly and stylish features of the personal computers then coming into vogue. Randy had used it quite a bit as an undergraduate and knew his way around. Even so, learning how to write good code on the thing required a lot of time. His life had changed when Charlene had come along, and now it changed more. He dropped out of the fantasy role-playing game circuit altogether, stopped going to meetings of the Society for Creative Anachronism, and began to spend all of his free time either with Charlene or in front of a computer terminal. All in all, this was probably a change for the better. With Charlene, he did things he wouldn't have done otherwise, like getting exercise or going to see live music. And at the computer, he was learning new skills, and he was creating something. It might be something completely useless, but at least he was creating. He spent a lot of time talking to Andrew Loeb, who actually went out and did the stuff he was writing programs for. He'd disappear for a few days and come back all wobbly and haggard, with fish scales caught in his whiskers or dried animal blood under his fingernails. He'd ram down a couple of Big Macs, sleep for 24 hours, then meet Randy in a bar. Charlene wasn't comfortable with having him in the house, and talk learnedly of the difficulties of day-to-day life, Aboriginal style. They argued about whether Aborigines would eat more disgusting parts of certain animals or throw them away. Andrew voted for yes. Randy disagreed. Just because they were primitive didn't mean they couldn't have taste. Andrew accused him of being a romantic. Finally, to settle it, they went up into the mountains together, armed with nothing but knives and Andrew's collection of exquisitely crafted vermin snares. By the third night, Randy found himself seriously thinking about eating some insects. QED, Andrew said. Anyway, Randy finished his software after a year and a half. It was a success. Chester and Abby liked it. Randy was moderately pleased at having built something so complicated that actually worked, but he had no illusions about its being good for anything. He was sort of embarrassed at having wasted so much time and mental energy on the project, but he knew that if he hadn't been writing code, he'd have spent the same amount of time playing games or going to Society for Creative Anachronism meetings in medieval drag, so it all zeroed out in the end. Spending the time in front of the computer was arguably better because it had honed his programming skills, which had been pretty sharp to begin with. On the other hand, he had done it all on the Unix system, which was for scientists and engineers, not a savvy move in an age when all the money was in personal computers. Chester and Randy had nicknamed Avi Avid because he really, really liked fantasy games. Avi had always claimed that he played them as a way of understanding what it was really like to live in ancient times, and he was a maniac about historical authenticity. That was okay. They all had half-assed excuses, and Avi's historical acumen frequently came in handy. Not long after this, Avi graduated and disappeared, and popped up a few months later in Minneapolis, where he had gotten a job with a major publisher of fantasy role-playing games. He offered to buy Randy's game software for the astonishingly large sum of $1,000 plus a small cut of future profits. Randy accepted the offer in his general outlines, asked Avi to send him a contract, then went out and found Andrew boiling some fish guts in a birch bark kettle atop a Weber grill on the roof of the apartment building where he lived. He wanted to give Andrew the good news and to cut him in on the proceeds. What ensued was a really unpleasant conversation, standing up there in a pelting, spitting, wind-blown rain. To begin with, Andrew took this deal far more seriously than Randy did. Randy saw it as a windfall, a lark. Andrew, who was the son of a lawyer, treated it as if it were a major corporate merger and asked many tedious and niggling questions about the contract, which did not exist yet and which would probably cover a single piece of paper when it did. Randy didn't realize it at the time, but by asking so many questions for which Randy had no answers, Andrew was, in effect, arrogating to himself the role of business manager. He was implicitly forming a business partnership with Randy that did not, in fact, exist. Furthermore, Andrew didn't have the first notion of how much time and effort Randy had put into writing the code. Or, as Randy was to realize later, maybe he did. In any case, Andrew assumed from the get-go that he would share a 50-50 split with Randy, which was wildly out of proportion to the work he'd actually done on the project. Basically, Andrew acted as if all the work he'd ever done on the subject of Aboriginal dining habits was a part of this undertaking, and that it entitled him to an equal split. By the time Randy extricated himself from this conversation, his mind was reeling. He had gone in with one view of reality and been radically challenged by another one that was clearly preposterous. But after an hour of Andrew's browbeating, he was beginning to doubt himself. After 2 or 3 sleepless nights, he decided to call the whole thing off. A paltry few $100s wasn't worth all of this agony. But Andrew, who was by now represented by an associate of his father's Santa Barbara law firm, vehemently objected. He and Randy had, according to his lawyer, jointly created something that had economic value, and a failure on Randy's part to sell it at market value amounted to taking money out of Andrew's pocket. It had become an unbelievable Kafkaesque nightmare, and Randy could only withdraw to a corner table at his favorite pub, drink pints of stout, frequently in the company of Chester, and watch this fantastic psychodrama unfold. He had, he now realized, blundered into some serious domestic weirdness involving Andrew's family. It turned out that Andrew's parents were divorced and long ago had fought savagely over custody of him, their only child. Mom had turned into a hippie and joined a religious cult in Oregon and taken Andrew with her. It was rumored that this cult engaged in sexual abuse of children. Dad had hired private dicks to kidnap Andrew back and then showered him with material possessions to demonstrate his superior love. There had followed an interminable legal battle in which Dad had hired some rather fringy psychotherapists to hypnotize Andrew and get him to dredge up repressed memories of unspeakable and improbable horrors. This was just the executive summary of a weird life that Randy had only learned about in bits and pieces as the years went on. Later, he was to decide that Andrew's life had been fractally weird. That is, you could take any small piece of it and examine it in detail, and it, in and of itself, would turn out to be just as complicated and weird as the whole thing in its entirety. Anyway, Randy had blundered into this life and become enveloped in the weirdness. One of the young eager beavers in Andrew's dad's law firm decided, as a preemptive move, to obtain copies of all of Randy's computer files, which were still stored on the UW computer system. Needless to say, he went about it in a heavy-handed way, and when the university's legal department began to receive his sullen letters, it responded by informing both Andrew's lawyer and Randy that anyone who used the university's computer system to create a commercial product had to split the proceeds with the university. So now Randy was getting ominous letters from not one, but 2 groups of deadly lawyers. Andrew then threatened to sue him for having made this blunder, which had halved the value of Andrew's share. In the end, just to cut his losses and get out of it clean, Randy had to hire a lawyer of his own. The final cost to him was a hair more than $5,000. The software was never sold to anyone, and indeed could not have been. It was so legally encumbered by that point that it would have been like trying to sell someone a rusty Volkswagen that had been dismantled and its parts hidden in attacked dog kennels all over the world. It was the only time in his life when he had ever thought about suicide. He did not think about it very hard or very seriously, but he did think about it. When it was all over, Avi sent him a handwritten letter saying, "I enjoyed doing business with you and look forward to continuing our relationship both as friends and, should opportunities arise, as creative partners." Indigo.